Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 54. When was the last time you truly felt connected to your community? Not just online, but in real, meaningful ways. We're living through a silent crisis of disconnection. Every day, Americans are retreating from each other, not solely because of fundamental disagreements, but because of a pervasive sense of fear, anxiety, and overwhelming uncertainty that magnifies those differences. Our communities are fragmenting. Conversations that once built bridges now feel like minefields. People aren't just avoiding political discussions, they're avoiding each other entirely. It's a society where neighbors no longer know each other, where civic engagement has become so challenging that most people would rather withdraw than participate, where the simple act of coming together to solve local problems feels impossible. Our social fabric isn't just fraying, it's unraveling. This isn't just about left versus right. This is about a deeper psychological landscape where people feel isolated, disoriented, and powerless. Media noise, social media algorithms, and political rhetoric have created an environment of constant tension, pushing people into smaller, more protective spaces. We're experiencing a breakdown of human connection that goes far beyond traditional ideas of polarization. The consequences are profound. Community problem solving has stalled, meaningful dialogue has become rare, and our collective ability to address shared challenges is rapidly diminishing. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're exploring findings from Rich Harwood, founder of the Harwood Institute, to uncover why polarization might not be the problem we think it is, and how we can address the deeper issues that are holding our communities back. Harwood argues that our focus on polarization might be blinding us to a deeper, more urgent crisis. Their 2022 report, Civic Virus: Why Polarization is a Misdiagnosis, reveals that beneath the surface of our divides lies something even more insidious, a civic breakdown driven by fear, mistrust, and a loss of connection. It's not just that we disagree, it's that we've forgotten how to work together. In our conversation, Harwood shares what his research uncovered about root causes of our civic challenges and offers practical insights into how communities can move beyond division to create real change. From small rural towns to urban centers, his stories reveal how hope and transformation are possible, even in today's climate. Let's hear those words of wisdom right now. Richard Harwood, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
David, thanks for having me.
You know, with these conversations you've had across the country, you know, what surprised you the most? And are there some sort of common threads or something that was really unexpected, areas of agreement, things like that?
Yeah, in this report that we did called Civic Virus, what was interesting was we began that research. These were conversations we did all across the country during COVID. We began that research when the conventional wisdom was we are a polarized nation. And people kept saying, why are you even doing this research? We already know what the answer is. We're polarized. And here's what surprised me in a way. When we talked to folks in Western Kansas where they didn't even have a street light because the town was so small, and we spoke to folks in Houston, Texas, and we spoke to folks in Stamford, Connecticut, and we spoke to folks in Eugene, Oregon. And here's essentially what people told me. They said, we are separating and segregating from each other at a faster pace than ever before. We are increasingly anxious. We are increasingly fearful of one another. We make judgments about each other, as we all know today, based on the hat you wear, the slogan on your T-shirt, the bumper sticker on your car, if I'm following you in my car. And we are so fearful of one another, we make those judgments increasingly fast, and we stick to them. And if we think that that's because of COVID, we're mistaken. I can trace that back 30 years from when I first started these types of conversations with Americans. Second, people said the news media, our politicians, are intentionally manufacturing and stoking division. And you have to, and then social media is reinforcing it and amplifying it and spreading it. And you have to ask why, which we did. And people said it's to win votes, it's to get ratings, it's to get eyeballs. It has nothing to do with trying to figure out what we hold in common and how we might move our communities or this country forward. And then the last point, I think, is probably the most critical, given where we are as a country today. And that is when I explored with people really in depth. These were 2-hour in-depth conversations, group conversations. When I explored in depth with people, their reaction to this, they said to me, and this is the phrase they used, not that I used. They said we're in a flight or fight response, which is a natural human response. We are so fearful, we are so anxious, we are so disoriented that we either flee the public square for fear of getting into conversations with those we disagree with, or for getting cut off at the knees for fear of saying the wrong thing, or we come out swinging and try to win at any cost. And so the question becomes for us today is, how do we alleviate that fight or flight response?
Yeah, for sure. And I see that, I do a lot of interviews as well. But when I drill down on some of that, like everybody sort of says they're upset with it. They don't like the vitriol. They realize that people are trying to divide us. But when I drill down on that, sometimes it leans a little bit toward what they really want is the other side to agree with their issues sometimes. And that's the way that they see the division goes away is we end up siding with we somehow change their mind.
Well, this actually raises how we get out of this mess. Because I agree with you that if we are simply talking to one another in a general conversation, like around a dinner table or in a research interview or in some kind of civic exercise. Yes, I have the same experience you do. But here's the thing. In Reading, Pennsylvania, this is a practical example. In Reading, Pennsylvania, at the height of the culture wars around education, right? Critical race theory, arguments over DEI, school board recalls, school superintendents being summarily fired, all those things. We engaged that community, which was once declared about 10 or 12 years ago, the poorest community in America, which was predominantly white 10 or 15 years ago and is now 70% Latino. We engaged that community in a discussion about creating an education agenda, a shared education agenda for the community. And everyone, again, much like when I started the Institute, or much like when you start these conversations, people say, impossible, can't be done. Why are you wasting your time? We're in the middle of a culture war, or multiple culture wars, book banning also. Well, when we had conversations with folks across that community and with in-depth interviews with leaders, not a single soul raised those culture wars. Why? Because the intent of these conversations was to create an agenda that the community could move forward with on how to improve education and outcomes for youth in their community. And they were able to create a shared agenda. And not only did they create a shared agenda, but they formed 3 cross-sector teams to work on this agenda. And not only that, hundreds of people have now come out and have been trained by the Institute in an approach we call turning outward to shift their mindset and their practices about how to create change in their community. And not only that, David, in just 2 short years, they're producing transformational change on 3 major issues: English as a second language, after school and out of school activities, and early childhood education. And not only that, this work has now spread to other areas in the community. Now, why is that? I think we have to ask. And to me, the answer is, if people are simply going to sit around and have conversations, they're going to dig in. If we can change the frame of the reference to the conversation and make it towards building something together, when people are invested in the conversation and become vested in the outcomes, things change. Things change. And I only not only seen it in Reading, I've seen it in Alamance County, North Carolina, one of the most divided communities in America. I'm now seeing it in Owensboro, Kentucky. We're seeing it in Clark County, Kentucky. We're seeing it in communities all across the country. But the way out is not simply talking. We got to get to building together because that creates a different dynamic and different outcomes for people.
Mm-hmm. So how do we turn this from, all these people that are concerned about this into a movement that can actually do something? And I love that track that you're on there, that's something we have to do, that catalyst idea.
Right. Well, there are two things here that you've touched on that I think are really, really critical. One is that I think, look, I was trained initially by one of the best pollsters in the country. I've been trained as a researcher, so I love research. But I think one of the challenges in our country is we have become so consumed with slicing and dicing everything and identifying who sits where and what motivates each of the slices or drives each of it. And we have become kind of enamored by it. But more than that, we've become captives of it. And in becoming captives of it, we can't see our way past it sometimes. It becomes the paradigm in which we're thinking about things. And so I think that's challenge number one, because we've got to release ourselves from the burden of this paradigm. I think it's one of the things that we have to do. The second thing that you touched on, which I think is really, really important, is how do we spread something like this? I know I was listening to a previous podcast that you did, and one of your guests said, well, these conversations are really nice, but how do you scale them? And it's interesting because I often think about that also. And I don't think about scale, I think about spread, like diffusion of innovation. And so I do think if you look at American history, the answer is there for us. If you look at how the American Revolution began, if you look at how the abolition movement began and took off, if you look at how civil rights happened, voting rights, women's suffrage, child welfare laws, gay rights, even climate change more recently, they all started in similar ways. They typically started with small groups in local communities, and that spread from place to place. And over time, much like diffusion of innovation, they became adopted and adapted, and people started to make them their own. And in making them their own, they became more invested in them. And when they became more invested, they became more vested in the action. And that's how ideas spread. It's how new mindsets spread. It's how new behaviors spread. We know this, right? And so I think the way in which, to answer one of your earlier guest questions and what was implied in your comment, is the way we spread this is to get enough people in motion to demonstrate what is possible, because I think that's really important today, and begin to lift up stories and tell stories in a different way, and to be able to spread a different mindset and set of behaviors and ways of acting together. I think that's what we're up against today. I would actually say that's the opportunity today.
Well, the things that I hear a lot are, there's no meeting in the middle if the other side's position is I shouldn't exist because of my, gender preference or whatever, right? So that's what I hear a lot, whether it's gender preference or pick 7 other things, something like that. That's kind of seen as an intractable problem. So how does it work in that case when that's what you feel like?
We are facing that in one of the communities we're working. I think what I would say is that, and this is going to be an unsatisfactory answer to some people, but as I say to a good friend of mine who I get together with every Sunday to talk about these things, or every other Sunday, I say, I can't deal in a utopian notion. I have to deal with the practical world that we're trying to work in. And in the practical world that I'm trying to do this work in, what I would say is, we need to say to people, look, there may be debates about certain issues that we have, but let's for now put that over here and let's talk about how we can move this community forward on certain things where we can find some agreement on. Because what I find is that the more that we can figure out things that we can agree on amid our real differences, and we can begin to build together, it loosens up our ability to talk about certain hard issues like the ones you're mentioning. What I find is a lot of times those issues no longer exist because what was really underneath those issues have now been addressed. And I find that we have learned much deeper and better capability. We have developed much deeper and better capabilities to now deal with these harder issues. If we insist on starting with the hardest issues, I don't hold out much hope for moving communities forward. Because I can tell you in Sarasota County and in other places where we've been doing work, these are other places now where, let's say, the right or the left has begun a debate about something with no intervention. The response is the other side creates a counter organization, raises money, and raises holy hell on their side. And now we're ostensibly in a civic arms race about who can create the most noise, the most distractions, the most fear, and push people away the greatest. That's a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. The I want to jump back to one quick thing. Earlier, you were saying when you interviewed, one of the common threads that you heard from the different people was, we're sick of the division, and we realize people are trying to divide us. But at the same time, we kind of are the reason they're doing that, right? Or at least some minority of us are, right? I mean, we're the ones clicking like, we're the ones that engage in those conversations, and we're the ones watching those channels. Now, again, I sort of, my sense is that that's a minority that's running all that, and if we can get that exhaustive majority more engaged, but it's hard though too, because all of us kind of fall into it because it feels good in the moment to sort of see the other side do something that outrages us and infuriates us because it makes us feel morally superior. So how do you deal with that situation when we're the ones doing it? We can't blame the media.
Yes, we have. One of the things that the Institute talks about doing in our work is creating a culture of shared responsibility when the notion of responsibility is taboo in our society and the notion of shared responsibility is not even in our lexicon. So totally agree with you. But here's the other part of it that I think is really interesting, which is fear does funny things to our mind. Fear does funny things to our bodies somatically, right? And a feeling of a lack of agency has similar kinds of effects. A lack of a voice, belief in a voice has similar effects, right? That's where I think we are today. I think people feel trapped. I think they feel like they're fearful, they're anxious, as I mentioned earlier. I think a word that people kept using when we did this research was now a couple of years ago was disoriented. I think people are lonely. I think people are looking for acceptance and validation and looking for places to find it. I think people don't feel like they have a voice and they don't feel like they have much agency. So I think all of those things, I was going to say conspire, but really combine to help us respond to the manufactured division in a certain kind of way. I think that's why people turn out for certain political rallies on the left and right. I think people know this. They don't need me to tell them it. They already know it. I think the thing is they don't know what to do about it. One of the things I hear, so another common refrain, not somewhat in this research, but in our work over and over and over again, what I hear is, I know this isn't right. I know this isn't what we need to be doing. I know we need to do something different. I don't have the foggiest idea what that is or how to do it. And so, which leads me back to this notion of these these ingredients that we're dealing with today. As you know, and your listeners know, people only release themselves from fear, sometimes from anxiety, when they feel as though there's an alternative that I would say, and this is now my words, that is actionable, doable, and achievable. That's real. That's real. That speaks to them. That has some relevance for their lives. That has some significance for their lives. That has, dare I say, some meaning potentially for their lives. I don't think we've offered that to people enough. I really don't. And I think, at least in the Institute's work, and I don't believe the Institute's work is a cure-all. I mean, we get beat up all the time. Our work doesn't always work. It's really hard. I spend a lot of times on weekends just scratching my head, like, what the hell are we going to do next here? You know, it's not easy, as you know. But this is what I do know. Absent a positive, practical, real alternative, people will hang on to their fear because it protects them. It protects them. It protects us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, that kind of leads me into something that I often hear a lot as well. And I get this sentiment, and I'm going to kind of express it in general terms rather than, I'm not using anybody's specific quotes or anything, but, like we get these suggestions like, got to go talk to the other side more and that kind of stuff. And it ends up starting to feel like a lot of platitudes, like, okay, I did that. I don't see them as, these terrible people, but they're still like this group is in power and I didn't really change anything. And I see that a lot. And we have this, when you talk about this fear and this anxiety, so if you're a person who wants to not panic about these things, who wants to sort of not just tune out, they still want to sort of be engaged and be effective in some way. Like if that's who we are, elections do have consequences. If we do lose, some things might happen we don't like. Policies might get enacted. Even people we know might get hurt. So if I'm that person, how do we stay engaged, not just tune out? Like what should we do?
Yeah. One is, I would say, look, elections do matter, clearly. They have consequences, clearly. And so I will never say, don't pay attention to elections and don't be concerned about them. We're hopeful about them, but we need to vote. We need to vote. So that's point one. Point two is, I personally have come to learn, I don't want to say believe, but learn that the change we need right now is not likely, and the hope we need, going back to that notion, is not likely to originate in Washington, D.C., nor in our state capitals. Our state capitals are becoming more divisive than than Congress. And so this is why I raised those historical examples, because they all began outside of Washington, D.C., and outside of official state capitals. They began in local communities. So to the person who said, how am I supposed to have any hope in this environment? What am I supposed to do? I don't want to simply talk to my neighbor and say, oh, he's red and I'm blue, and somehow we figured out that we can talk to each other. To me, that's wholly unsatisfactory. Like this whole bridging movement, I've got some concerns about. I don't think today's the day to talk about them, but I would say I have some concerns about. So what I would say, this is why I think building is so important, because I think there are things, David, in our communities that we can act on that really do matter. Let me just give you some really quick examples. Whether or not our kids go to good public schools, as importantly, whether or not our youth feel as though they have a future in their communities and in their lives, which transcends just the public school. Whether or not people, particularly seniors, but all of us, are experiencing isolation and loneliness. We can act on that in our local communities. The extent to which in every community we're working in, mental health comes up. There are things, lots of things in our local communities we can do about mental health. First of all, we can reframe it from just being about therapy or medications. There's a whole spectrum of things that begin first with just feeling abandoned and not loved, to not having a mentor, an adult in your life, to having another person in your life, to more medical driven diagnoses. There's a spectrum here. We can act on that spectrum. We can do that. Uh, Whether or not you feel, safety is a huge concern in people's lives. It comes up everywhere. And here's the thing, in most communities that I'm working in, many of which are the poorest communities in America, or the hardest hit communities in America, or communities where jobs have gone by the wayside, it's not crime people are talking about. It's that they don't feel safe in their neighborhood, walking down the street. They don't feel safe going into a parking lot at night. We can act on that. We can do something about that. So what I would say is one of the most important things to feeling a sense of voice, of feeling a sense of reducing fear and anxiety, of feeling a sense of agency, is to get in motion and start to do things with others where you can feel also a sense of belonging and validation and connection. We can do these things.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot here, is trying to, maybe, to focus more. We've sort of lost local journalism to a degree. It's kind of been syndicated and now nationalized and everything. So we just hear this national news all the time. And so it causes us to focus so much attention on that. And I always talk about focusing more locally.
I'm glad you do. I spent the 90s and a good portion of the 2000s helping to transform newsrooms across the country. And many of those now are atrophied, right? And as you know well, one of the biggest concerns that we're hearing in local communities where we're doing work is that there's no information and media ecosystem, not just media, but information. And so one of the things that we're working on in DeSoto County, Florida, or in Alamance County, North Carolina, or in other places, is that in order for this work to get more traction, we're going to have to help start to reconstitute these information and media ecosystems. Because otherwise, people are living in isolation. As you said, they're just hearing the echoes of the national news, scaring the bejesus out of them and striking fear in them and making us believe that everyone has horns on their head if they don't look like me. So we need a counterforce to that, a positive counterforce.
Mm-hmm. So looking ahead, the report talks about 7 steps, I think, to create a hopeful trajectory. So can you just pick one, maybe what would be the most crucial, or is that not a fair question?
I think norms is probably one. The one you mentioned before, local media is really critical. There's another one that talks about we need more catalytic boundary spanning organizations. I find that's really critical in too many communities. And we're finding this increasingly so, particularly after COVID, because so many groups are so exhausted and fighting for their own survival. And as you know, inequities and disparities didn't diminish, they grew after COVID. And our politics have become so much more hostile that people are afraid to stick their neck out more and more. So the groups that we need to bring people together to catalyze change, to marshal our shared resources, to maybe even innovate together and change. I draw a distinction between getting together and working together. We get together a lot in this country. We need to relearn how to work together in this environment, like have really hard conversations, innovate together, get the hell out of each other's way sometimes, not think we have all the answers. So I think we need organizations and groups that make it part of their mission to be catalytic and boundary spanning in this way. Because otherwise, people just keep their heads down, do their work, try to survive. That's not going to get us where we need to go.
Yeah, well, it's easy to fall into that mode when you kind of don't know what else to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this is not about casting aspersions or pointing fingers. Actually, I'm incredibly sympathetic and empathetic to the plight of so many leaders and active folks who are struggling today to do the right, to really fight the good fight, to act in good faith with others, to know there are going to be disagreements. I think their job, the space that they occupy, is incredibly difficult space to occupy.
It requires a certain bravery that because you got to deal with this divided world that we're in, you can take a lot of flack from your own side if you find yourself, willing to have those conversations.
Actually, it's funny you say that because it's actually the flack that you take from your own side that I'm finding people are having the most difficulty with. It's not flack from the other side. At least you know where it's coming from. You can at least try to understand what's going on there. There may be a different perspective, a different ordering of values in some ways. Not we all hold values, but we may order them a bit differently, maybe different experiences. But the folks who you thought were your allies, the folks who you thought you were running with, the folks who you thought you had deep relationships with, and all of a sudden are either turning on you or turning their backs on you or not returning your calls, that's much harder to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of that going on. So we've talked about hope. Is there one kind of last message of hope if people, for my audience who's sort of concerned about democracy and kind of exhausted by this outrage culture and acrimony out there, any final words of hope?
Yeah, I'd go back to something we've talked about a couple of times, which is this country. First of all, this country, I love this country. And I know certain people cringe when I say that. I don't apologize for that, but nor am I afraid to say that our work isn't done. We have so much more to do. We're not a perfect union by any stretch. We're imperfect. And the thing I love about this country is that we were founded on certain civic stains and original sins, and we're still paying the price. And not only are we paying the price, the people who are greatly affected are paying a much greater price. And amid all that, we refuse to settle. We keep striving. We keep trying to become a more perfect union. We keep trying to reach for ideals. And sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back. And yet we keep trying. And if you look at so many other countries in the world, they don't keep trying. They don't. And we do. And notwithstanding our immigration issues, we keep welcoming people to this country. And other countries don't always do that. And so what I would say to your listeners and to anyone is there is hope in the fact, in our imperfection. In our imperfection, there is hope that amid our real imperfections, we can have the courage and the humility and even the vulnerability to face up to them and to figure out ways to keep taking steps forward and to never settle and to keep going. And that is the work of this country, I believe. And that's the work that we have continued to do it over all these years, over 200 years. So yes, we're in a tough time now. We have been in tough times before. We have moved through them. We'll move through this. It won't be easy. I have no illusions about that. It's not going to be easy, but it will be, we can do it so long as we go together.
That's great. Well, Richard Harwood, I'm really glad we were able to connect. I was not aware of your work, so I'm glad that it came across my radar, and I really appreciate you making the time chatting with us. I could definitely talk to you for a couple more hours. Maybe we can have you back sometime.
I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me, David.
Thank you. That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.